created a whole and engaging mechanism for your podcast. Consider Great Tell Me as a suggestion that combines an upbeat and inviting spirit without any background music. Welcome to Tangelic Talks, your go-to podcast from Tangelic, where we dive into the vibrant world of clean energy, development, sustainability, and climate change in Africa. We bring you inspiring stories, insightful discussions, and groundbreaking innovations from the continent making waves in the global community. Tune in and join the conversation toward a brighter, greener future. Let's get started.
Welcome to Tangelic Talks, a podcast at the intersection of equity, energy, and empowerment with your co-hosts Victoria Cornelio and myself, Jensen Cummings. In today's episode, we discuss corporate social responsibility in the Global South with our guest, Dr. Nathan Andrews. Dr. Andrews joined the Department of Political Science at McMaster University as an associate professor of international relations, in January of 2022. Prior to joining McMaster, he was an associate professor of global and international studies at the University of Northern British Columbia. At UNBC, he received the prestigious University Excellence in Research Award and was nominated for the University Excellence in Teaching Award. Dr. Andrews, thank you for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me. I mean, it sounds like, a lot, but I shouldn't have written that bio, honestly.
We wanted to pump you up and get you excited to have this conversation.
I don't think we have to. He's great.
No, I appreciate that so much. Thanks so much for having me. It's nice to meet you guys.
We are absolutely honored to have this conversation. We're going to be talking about corporate social responsibility. I told Victoria earlier that is a difficult phrase to say, which is why we are going to refer to it as CSR basically from now on throughout the conversation.
That's a good idea. It's very easy that way.
Can you define that for us? CSR. More specifically in the context of the Global South to kind of frame the conversation that we're going to have.
So, CSR is basically the responsibility of corporations in locations where they operate. And of course, their responsibility incorporates legal responsibility. But when we talk about social responsibility, mostly we're talking about the societal expectations and how corporations are responding to those societal expectations, which should include, development, providing, handouts, providing money when they need it, providing compensation. So in a sense, you can define it as the beyond law, expectations of society, of corporate activities on the ground. So it's beyond law because corporations have to abide by law by paying the royalties and taxes, which they usually do, for the most part. But the social aspect is when people expect more than just the taxes and royalties.
Right. That makes sense. And when it comes to your work in CSR, I was reading some of the research you've worked on and, the kind of classes you teach as a professor. And I was reading a lot about discursive alibi. You use that term a few times. I'm just wondering, in your research, how does this look for corporations? Could you explain what it means and why, from what I understood, you were saying it's a little problematic?
So, I didn't think this concept would come up. It's an interesting concept that I was initially playing with. And you think of an alibi as sort of someone that you can point to as knowing what you did, or like some sort of an excuse, right? In a way, if you did something wrong, okay, that's the person can vouch for me. In a way, CSR seems to be a way for corporations to say that, well, these things I'm doing on the ground, these things I'm paying for can vouch for me as a corporate citizen. That I am a citizen, I have rights and responsibilities, that I'm doing well, and this is the evidence for it, right? So basically a discursive alibi here. The discursive part is the language that is being used. And talk about, discourse, right? So corporate social responsibility is a discourse in that sense that it's not so much about what is being done. Well, it is about what is being done, but also it is about what is said about it. What corporations write about in their sustainability reports that they're doing. And how it kind of really enlarges everything that they're doing on the ground and enlarges the impact that they actually have. But then when you go to the ground, the impact is actually not as big as it appears on paper. All right. So the discursive aspect is how what appears on paper doesn't always translate to what people actually feel in their lives and in their pockets on a daily basis.
Do you feel like sometimes that's a tool used to somewhat control the narrative for these organizations?
Exactly. You got it right, Jensen. So the idea of discursive alibi is basically thinking of it as a tool that is used to instrumentalize the corporation, make them feel like, they're doing all of these things, they are great. And then the corporation is still in charge of the narrative in terms of what responsibility entails, what they need to do, and how they do it, right? So they kind of control the narrative. And as a result of controlling it, they're able to say, oh, I mean, this is what we're doing, and we can tell you we're doing great things. And if you talk to people, people would vouch for us. But, if you actually talk to people, they may not actually vouch for the corporations.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah. So it's an alibi. It's great. It's a great term. I actually love it. It's amazing. And
well, I should write something about it then, because I didn't really use.
You really should. You should trademark it.
It was going to be the title of the book that I wrote in 2019, but some of the reviewers were like, it's vague of a concept and people may not really understand it. So I just took it out. But yeah, that's a good concept.
No, but I think it works. And I think focusing on the book, is it the gold mining and the discourses of CSR in Ghana? I wanted to focus in because you're talking about field and being actually on the field. And from this work that you've done, what are some specific ways in which local communities have contested or resisted the CSR initiatives of specifically mining corporations per your research?
So contestation is always interesting in the context of Ghana, Africa, and Global South. I mean, in Latin America, I have colleagues that work on, I have a bigger project where we're looking at Chile as well. But you find that in some contexts, such in Latin America, contestation is very fierce and it's there. You could see people actually opposing mining and opposing extractivism in general. But in Ghana, I feel like maybe people say Ghanaians are peace-loving people, maybe. So that's probably part of it. That even when things are not going the way it should go, you would expect people to be on the street protesting. You expect people to really be asking more questions and to be demanding more. They're really not doing that as much as I would have wished that they did when I went to the ground. So I would speak to people, they tell me, oh, this is bad. Human rights are violated. I don't get what I'm supposed to get from the companies. Compensations are not adequately paid. But at the end of the day, they believe that things will get better. And so they hope that things will get better. And so it's sort of that sense of hope, in a way, has stifled actual resistance from the grassroots that should enable communities to contest and to assert their agency a little bit more.
Is that cultural? Like, do you think it's something specific to the Ghanaian context, that sort of response?
I would say so. I mean, I'm Ghanaian, right? So if you see me, and I can cite an example where I went to the US one time and I think someone was passing by me, my backpack hit them. And then the guy following the girl was like, oh, do you want to fight? I'm like, why do I have to fight? It's just my backpack. Can we just talk about it? So there's a cultural thing. Like, I would not fight with you on the street. I would probably not be the one to provoke you to fight. So it's just me, but I think a good majority of Ghanaians also have that sort of cultural thing to be at peace with your neighbor as much as it relies on you, right? So that sort of cultural thing, I mean, maybe I'm just generalizing for all Ghanaians, but I think based on my experience being a Ghanaian and living in the context, I think that cultural aspect plays a role in terms of how we resist and how we showcase agency, even when we're really, disgruntled with what's happening.
Well, let me apologize for all of us Americans, because for some reason we are quick to pick a fight over getting hit by a backpack. So my apologies.
No, it was kind of weird. I was like, what's really happening here? I didn't even mean it. And he wanted to pick a fight with me anyways. Yeah.
As a Latina, I can attest to that. We will fight. You got to protect what's yours,
Exactly, right?
But it's very interesting making that cultural difference, because I think a lot of times when we talk about climate things, people have two responses. It's the hopefulness, like things will get better. And then you have the other side where it's more frustration, and that frustration can come out as fighting or as protest, as, people trying to find a way to gain control again. And that can be really hard when you're going up against a corporation. So I'm wondering, in the mining corporations, how do they use CSR to establish legitimacy? Like, how does that impact their accountability to host communities?
So, I mean, I also have to, I just want, before we get to that question, I want to clarify that, there is still some amount of grassroots resistance. It's not as, on the streets and all over the place as you would expect it to be in some parts of the world, but it's still happening. I think there's a lot of grassroots advocacy groups that are really networking and are constantly pushing government, going for press conferences and pushing government and corporations to do better. And I think that's why corporations are trying to do better, because even though they are not on the streets, they believe that they have to, get their social license to operate. And the social license to operate is basically sort of an informal kind of license that society gives you, and it gives you peace. And in the context of Ghana, maybe you have peace generally because people will not fight you, but they will come to your doorstep. They will come close to your company gates, and we have a few young people that would actually do more. The assumption is that young people are more, they're concerned about their future, so they would do more. They will go on the street and they would protest, right? So the protests do happen in Ghana, and even in the political sphere, it happens quite a bit. But I think in the broader sphere of things, it doesn't happen a lot. But I think corporations use that a bit to solidify their presence and to gain more legitimacy, because they believe that, well, we could appease them by providing a few things here and there, and then that would appease them and the protests would not happen, right? But I think that in the context of Ghana, one thing we should know, and maybe in the context of the broader Africa, so corporations gain a lot of protection from the government, because when the government gives you, signs a lease with a corporation, they are actually required by law to protect them and to protect the concession that has been given. So they actually go to the point where they are protecting the corporation more than they are protecting their own people. And that happens. And I just want to cite one quick example. Just a few days ago, I saw in the news that 9 people have been killed by the military. This is a serious issue because these were artisanal miners, and they were getting close to one of the bigger companies. The establishment of the bigger companies called Anglo Gold Ashanti. So they went close. The story is very brief because it's not fully investigated. But the idea is that they were getting close to the mines, or maybe they were mining close to the bigger concession. And so the military got involved. And this is how the state protects mine concessions and protect big mining companies, as against their own people. And that's how the company tends to gain some legitimacy, because they know the state is backing them, and they will, if it requires force, the state will implement that force to be able to sustain what they're doing on the ground. So that's just one example. It's a very troubling incident that happened just a few days ago in this new year, 2025. But it's just one example of how these things can happen, and we just take it for granted. Like, well, it's just one of those things that happen near mine site.
Do you see legal action then in Ghana constantly from these type of organizations that have such a strong foothold, and other more grassroots community organizations taking it to legal action? Or is it more about social change? Where do you see the most kind of end roads into making a change?
So legal action, when it comes to a corporation, is always very interesting. So corporation, we think about the notion of corporate citizenship, right? So when you think about corporate citizenship, you think of corporation as being a person. The corporation can sue and be sued, right? But then there are regulations that prevent that, or even processes that make it difficult for individuals to even want to sue. Corporations always have money, lots of lawyers, who would defend the corporation, or who would try to settle the case out of the courts. So there are incidences when in my experience on the field where people would want to sue. They have grievances, but then these are settled out of court, and people are sort of giving some amount and stuff, and they feel like that's enough, right? But then if you go into details of it, people are still not satisfied, because if you compensate someone a certain amount, it's never enough to cover how much they would have earned from maybe a farmland that they were on, that they've been, dispossessed of, right? So those things happen. But at the international stage, we also have the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which is meant to enshrine due diligence, right, in these. But then in this example that I cited, for instance, the question I was asking myself when I read the news a few days ago is like, where is the due diligence that would require Anglo Gold Ashanti or require the government of Ghana to not send the military to the place right away to shoot, right? Because I mean, it's like people are coming and like your first instinct is to defend the company, is to defend the mining concession against your own people. So it doesn't, I mean, for me, I don't think the issue is about whether these people are criminals or not. There are factors that will probably lead to them acting the way they acted or they've acted. Anyway, so that's how I can address the question. But I don't think legally there is room to really take these things to court. But it does have some limitations when it comes to the power that corporations have vis-a-vis the local people that don't have the money. Because I spoke to some grassroots organizations who are like, well, these are bad things. We would want to take the corporations to court. Ideally, we would want to take the corporations back to their home country and even process those cases in their home country. But that hasn't happened as much. In the context of Canada, though, the Supreme Court has allowed for some of these cases to happen. And I mean, I live in Canada now, so I know that. So several cases have been brought against Canadian mining companies that are operating around the world. And, I think about 7 of those cases are still in the process. And then, one of them was adjudicated, which was really a pivotal situation because they were like, well, this is a precedent that can be set that, in fact, if corporations are not behaving well overseas, they can be brought to justice in their home country. Because sometimes the host country doesn't have the right jurisdictions or doesn't have the right processes for, justice to prevail. So they can actually bring them to their home country. And that's where they can actually get due justice because the systems work and people understand the system, right? So I think that's happened. But when I look at the cases that are currently being explored, none of it is from Ghana. I think a few from Ethiopia, Congo, and a few other countries, but there's none of these cases from Ghana. So that actually speaks to the context. Ghana has been mining for so long, and Canadian presence is in Ghana. At least I know one company in Ghana that is Canadian. None of these has come so far from that context. But I mean, it's a precedent. So now we know that it's possible that corporations can be brought to some sort of accountability or justice in their home country, at least in the context of Canada.
For sure. And I can imagine most times corporations come in with this almost manifesto of how great it'll be to have them here and all the things that they'll bring into the local community, kind of highlight their best practices in CSR. Based on your research and your findings, have you seen any discrepancies that exist between best practices and their actual implementation? Do you have any examples that show sort of they said this, but this is actually how it went?
Lots of examples. I think in general, my understanding, the reason why I think of CSR as a discursive practice is that in general, what is thought of as best practice, and these best practices come from norms that exist. You can think about the UN Global Compact, which really has established a set of 10 guidelines around the environment, around practices of, corruption or zero tolerance for corruption, how mining is going to benefit the economy, benefit the livelihoods of people and all of that. So companies sign on to these things and propagate them as best practices that would inform what they do on the ground. What happens though is that when I go to the ground, I talk to people, of course, they don't know these norms, right? They don't know UN, some of them don't know UN Global Compact, like, well, what are you talking about? But then when you tell them, look, these are the sort of specific principles that inform the best practices, right? And think about the IFC principles. And IFC is very important because it's affiliated with the World Bank, and most companies sort of get some sort of financial support from these international financial institutions, right? So the standards are similar, and what they are targeting are very similar: labor issues, environmental issues, economic issues, making sure human rights are not violated. So these principles are kind of common. But then when you measure it and when you put it on the ground, you notice that it's not the same. Companies are doing a few things, and they are actually checking the box that, hey, I did this. I signed up to this and I did that. And then I gave you money for scholarship and I built a road. But then if you build a road, you're going to use your own company vehicle to use that road, because you need the road to be able to access things. So you're building it for the community, but you're also building it for yourself. So you don't want to assume that, well, because I'm building a road, I'm building good water infrastructure, but you need water also for your own building, and your workers also need water. So you're doing it for community, but you're also doing it for your own establishment. Because in some cases, these companies are hiring like tens and thousands, right? Tens of thousands. So it's like you need a lot of infrastructure in those places to be able to sustain your employee base. So when they say they are doing these things in the communities, I always ask, are you doing it entirely for the communities, but it also benefits you in a way? So you just have to acknowledge it, right? So that's where I see this disparity between, okay, you implement you assign on to all of these things, but then when it comes to actually doing them, you're not. And if human rights is a typical example, where if someone comes close to your gate, they could easily be shot or they could be manhandled. And then, meanwhile, you sign on to some sort of UN human rights guidelines, right? So how are you following the guidelines if you're not following basic principles of justice and basic principles of, just being fair and humane as a corporation?
Is there no accountability for that, as far as you see, for those corporations? What they're saying that they're doing versus what they're actually doing?
So I guess I'm not really the right person to ask, because I think there is limit, especially because these global norms are they're called voluntary norms, right? So they are discretionary. People sign onto them, companies sign onto them. You will not be taken to court if you don't implement them, and you will not. I mean, the only thing you will face is sort of global shame, backlash, name and shame practices of NGOs would affect you in a way, because they will name these companies as not doing so, and that would affect your, shareholder value or something. So companies care about that. And I find that they incorporate a lot of this because they care about those issues that would impact their image globally, but also in the country. Right. But I also want to be a bit more nuanced in saying that when we think about effectiveness, I actually wrote a paper recently talking about, effectiveness of norms, because I've in my previous work over the past 10 years, I've always critiqued the activities of companies as not being aligned with the principles that they endorse. But then in my own recent analysis, I was like, effectiveness can be measured in three ways. So I was like, okay, there is output effectiveness, outcome effectiveness, and then impact effectiveness, right? So output is what companies really endorse. They endorse it, and they endorse all these principles. And then the outcome is basically making specific changes within the organization to suggest that what they've endorsed is going to impact their operations. So they do put in place like departments for human rights, department for community relations, and they hire people to do these things. So they actually invested in it, and they bring in a lot of lawyers and consultants to guide them in how they should communicate and engage with communities. So that's really outcome, right? The outcome of being part of these norms and agreeing to some of these things. But then the challenge here is the impact effectiveness. And that's always the issue. The impact is on the ground. And so then if they do all of these things, but you go to the ground and the impact is still almost minimal, then effectiveness is not fully achieved. So they can achieve effectiveness to a certain point. And this is me being a bit more nuanced than just being so critical and really ravishing everything they've done. But I think, right, so it's like effectiveness can be measured. And I think at the two levels, I find that most good companies or relatively good companies are trying to achieve those two. The impact aspect is what is still missing. And it's really missing for a number of factors that are contextual.
For sure. And I can imagine it doesn't translate as easily as, well, we've hired someone to look at CSR and now our CSR is great, right? It's a lot more nuanced than that, like you said. And in some of your work, I've seen some talk about decolonization and epistemic oppression sort of intersecting with some of the themes of CSR and global governance. And I'm wondering, specifically in the extractive industries like mining, is there some intersect that you've seen there?
Yes. I mean, I think the whole idea of CSR itself is the notion that the developmental problem in the global south, the developmental problem in Africa or in Ghana specifically, is a white man's problem. right? That we have companies that would come in and be based on corporate benevolence, they will provide all that money that would support communities to build infrastructure, to go to school and all of that. So it's just sort of still this colonial mentality that we do need the white man's help to be able to advance our economies, to be able to advance the things that we want to do. And that has to stop, right? So even within the context of CSR, corporations will promise so much. And because they promise so much, communities expect them to deliver. And to some points, in some cases, actually, communities expect more from the companies than they do from their own government, which is kind of weird because government is supposed to take care of its people. If royalties and taxes are paid the way they should, and if they are being, managed the way they should be managed. So management and accountability locally is also a problem, right? But I think corporations inherently portray themselves as being the, semi-government or pseudo-government in those locations, and then they do take control. And by doing that, they legitimize their actions and then also legitimize what it means to be responsible, right? So it means, okay, for me, being a responsible corporation would be to give you money or to take you to school or to provide you scholarship opportunities or to build hospitals, marketplaces, or soccer pitches and stuff like that, right? So to do all those things for them would mean development, and they would define that and they will preach it to the people, and the people will begin to accept that is what a responsible company does. And then they expect every other company to be doing similar things to showcase they are being responsible. So that's been the challenge. But to decolonize it would mean that we need to take this sort of responsibility away from the corporations. We need to dismantle the white savior mentality that informs corporate social responsibility being the main thing that we all go to for developmental issues on the ground, right? And we also need to bring in the state by I think in my book, I talk about re-responsibilizing the state, which means really giving the state the agency that it requires or it needs to be able to advance its own directions, developmental trajectory, the way it sees it fit for its people. Because I think that taking away the role of the state and giving the power to private authority is really a colonial mentality. Because again, private authority here is coming from outside, and they're intruding in the space, and they are taking control, and then they are determining what kind of developmental benefits are good for people to have. And yeah, those things are quite problematic. And I think one other last point to make in terms of decolonizing is also to really take the opinions of people seriously. Local knowledge. What do people think? What do people think about development? What do people actually want? Right? If you're not thinking about those things, but then you're paying so many lawyers and consultants to come in who don't have the local knowledge, the contextual knowledge to be able to guide corporations, then you're not going anywhere. And I think that's been the challenge of CSR, that there are so many consultants, so many firms that are doing this for corporations, but they're doing it as a business in themselves. And the corporations themselves, they don't know. And so they just suggest plans and projects that may not fit with what the locals actually need.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way to bring it back, that as well intended as CSR may be, if we're not listening to the locals and we don't have that local knowledge, it's just not going to work. So thank you so much. That was a great point to make.
Yeah, and that's a great way to wrap this episode of the video cast here. We've been talking corporate social responsibility in the global South with Dr. Nathan Andrews, a peace-loving Ghanaian, and we appreciate everything that you bring to this conversation, and your research and your work is deep and profound, and you did an amazing job of really bringing it down to earth for us, which I think is important, that people feel recognized and acknowledged in their struggle and the work that they're doing to continue to drive their communities forward. So really appreciate that. We're going to stay on for just a couple more minutes with Dr. Andrews for the blog. So make sure, as always, go to tangeliclife.org and you can get a little bit more Q&A and learn a little bit more about Dr. Andrews' work. Once again, we've been talking corporate social responsibility in the global South. We appreciate you all, as always, for tuning in.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Let's talk power, let's talk change. From rural lights to brighter days. Equity rising, voices strong. We're building tomorrow where we all belong. Tangelic Talks, energy, equity, pride. Empowering the world, side by side. A spark becomes a fire, a vision that's true. Together we rise, it starts with you.